He had always been good at what he did, though he would never admit it to anyone, or even to himself. From the outside, people saw him as confident, capable, and in control, a professional who moved with purpose through meetings, deadlines, and presentations. Yet inside, he carried a secret weight, one heavier than any project or responsibility, the constant, nagging feeling that he didn't belong, that sooner or later, someone would realize he was a fraud. It began subtly, in quiet moments when the office was empty, when the hum of computers and the faint smell of coffee seemed to amplify every doubt. He would stare at his work and think, "This isn't impressive. Anyone could do this." Even accolades felt tainted, a reminder that luck, timing, or other people's mistakes had conspired to make him look competent. No matter how much he achieved, he could never silence the voice inside that whispered he was cheating the system, even when he hadn't. He noticed it in small ways first. When he received praise, he felt a twist of guilt, as though each compliment was a reminder of the lie he was living. When a coworker asked for advice, he hesitated, fearing that any guidance he offered would eventually reveal his own inadequacy. Every success, every step forward, seemed to demand an explanation he could never provide. And so he learned to cheat, not in the world, but in his mind. He lied to himself to survive. He told himself that everyone else was exceptional, that his achievements were circumstantial, that recognition was a fluke. The cheat wasn't to others, it was internal, a distortion of reality so convincing that it became habit. At first, it was manageable. A trick here, a rationalization there, a little mental sleight of hand that allowed him to keep moving forward without feeling like an imposter. But the longer he lived this way, the more real the deception became. His thoughts shaped his behavior, and soon he avoided opportunities, fearing exposure. Invitations to speak or lead projects were quietly declined. Promotions were passed over. Even friendships carried a shadow. He worried that his closest allies would see through the facade, that the laughter and conversation were acts of charity rather than genuine camaraderie. One evening, late in the office after everyone else had left, he looked at his reflection in the glass window. The city lights blurred behind him, a glittering expanse of human accomplishment that felt completely unreachable. And yet, in that distorted reflection, he recognized something else, a truth he had long ignored. The cheat he had perfected was not a trick on the world, it was a trick on himself. By insisting he was unworthy, he had hidden from the very thing that mattered most, that he could, in fact, do remarkable things. The fraud, the imposter, was a narrative he had authored. He remembered a conversation from years ago with someone who had noticed the hesitation in his step, the self-doubt that he tried to mask with humor and efficiency. "You're your own worst critic," the person had said, almost casually. He had laughed nervously, but the word stuck. Your own worst critic. It was true. He had spent years measuring his worth against an invisible standard, lying to himself about what was real and what was imagined. And in that lie, he realized he had been both the cheat and the cheated, the imposter and the victim. The revelation didn't erase the doubt overnight. It didn't magically transform him into someone confident or fearless. But it offered a small, radical freedom. He could stop lying to himself. He could acknowledge the fear, the insecurity, and the anxiety without letting them dictate his life. Each achievement didn't have to be a fluke. Each compliment didn't have to be a trap. And maybe, just maybe, admitting to his own worthiness was the hardest, most honest form of courage there was. In the weeks that followed, he began to take small risks, testing the boundaries of the self-imposed limitations he had carried for so long. He said yes to projects he would have declined before. He allowed himself to celebrate successes, quietly at first, then with more confidence. And slowly, he realized that the imposter syndrome cheat was fading, not because the doubt disappeared, but because he had stopped feeding it. The greatest lie he had ever told, it turned out, had been to himself. And finally, he was learning to tell the truth. Even as he began to take these tentative steps towards self-acceptance, the old habits clung stubbornly. On mornings when the world seemed quieter, he found himself scanning emails and reports, convinced that any oversight, any small misstep, would immediately expose him. Every success still felt borrowed, every compliment still suspicious, and yet, a strange duality had begun to emerge. He could feel the fear and acknowledge it at the same time. It was in the subtle moments that the illusion of competence was most seductive. During meetings, when his ideas were praised, he would catch himself thinking, they must not really understand. They can't see the cracks. But now, instead of retreating into silence, he began to observe the thought, almost like watching someone else's reflection in a mirror. He realized that this pattern, the cheat of underestimating himself, was a way to control disappointment. By pretending he was undeserving, he created an excuse for failure before it happened. In effect, the lie protected him, but it also imprisoned him. He began journaling late at night, not to record events, but to confront them. Each entry became a dialogue with himself, a painstaking unmasking of the false narratives he had repeated for years. I am not a fraud. I have earned this. Even typing the words felt dangerous, as if saying them aloud might shatter the fragile safety net he had built. And yet, the act of acknowledgement brought relief, a slow loosening of chains he had not even known were binding him. Social interactions became a new battlefield. He noticed the subtle ways he downplayed achievements in conversation, how he laughed off praise, how he deflected questions about his work. The cheat had infiltrated not just his mind, but his relationships. People assumed humility, perhaps even admired it, but he knew the truth. It was fear masquerading as modesty. He wanted to be honest, yet honesty carried risks. To admit he was competent, even great, was to risk judgment, envy, or disappointment. And yet, for the first time, he wondered if the risk might be worth it. One evening, a colleague approached him, holding a project proposal he had hesitated to lead. You should do this, the colleague said simply. You're the best person for it. The word should have caused panic. Normally, he would have laughed, made a joke, or found a reason to step aside. But something inside him shifted. He paused, felt the familiar wave of doubt, then allowed himself a thought that had been almost impossible before. Maybe I am. The decision to accept the project felt like stepping onto a tightrope, every step conscious, every breath measured. Yet as he navigated the first challenges, he discovered something unexpected. The mistakes he feared were not catastrophic. The praise he received was genuine. The success he achieved was for once his own. And the more he acknowledged it, the less the imposter voice could dictate the narrative. But the battle was far from over. Some days, the old voice returned, whispering louder than ever, especially when he compared himself to peers or when a new challenge loomed. The cheat, he realized, was a lifelong companion, not an enemy to be vanquished entirely, but a shadow to be recognized and outsmarted. And in recognizing it, he found a strange kind of power. He could act despite doubt, succeed despite fear, and still honor the complexity of his own mind. By the end of the year, he looked back and saw a life subtly transformed. Opportunities he once shied away from were now within reach. Relationships were deeper, more honest. Achievements were no longer tainted by the pretense of luck or circumstance. And still, every morning, the reflection in the mirror reminded him that perfection was an illusion, that doubt would return, and that the imposter syndrome, cheat, would always lurk. But for the first time, he met it without fear, knowing that the greatest victory was not in silencing the doubt, but in choosing to act anyway. In the quiet of the night, when the city slept and he alone reflected on the day, he realized the paradox that had defined his life. The cheat that had once imprisoned him, lying to himself about his own worth, had also taught him the most essential truth. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was the refusal to let a false narrative define your limits. And with that realization, he could finally step forward, not as a fraud, but as the very person he had always been capable of becoming. Morning light spilled through the blinds, sharp and unyielding, yet he felt neither comfort nor motivation. Instead, it carried a quiet accusation. You're not enough. You never will be enough. He sat at his desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard, staring at the blinking cursor as if it held the answer to all his doubts. Emails piled up, each one a silent test he feared failing. Every message from a supervisor or a client seemed like a trap, a subtle reminder that the world was waiting for him to slip. And yet he continued, because to stop would be to admit, even to himself, that the cheat, the mental lie he had perfected over years, was not fooling anyone, least of all him. The cheat had many faces. Sometimes it appeared as over-preparation, double-checking slides, revising reports, rehearsing conversations until they lost all naturalness. Other times it emerged as avoidance, declining meetings, dodging projects, making excuses that sounded reasonable to everyone but were self-punishments in disguise. He had become an expert in the art of self-deception, constructing elaborate rationales for why he was not ready, not capable, not deserving. It was exhausting, and yet it felt safe. Safety, he realized, had been the true reward of the cheat. He remembered a moment from years ago, at a conference where he had been invited to speak. Standing backstage, he felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He glanced at the audience through the curtains, a sea of eager faces, and thought, they're going to see me for who I really am. And in that moment, he almost fled. Almost. But he didn't. He walked onto the stage, voice shaking at first, heart hammering. By the end, the applause was thunderous. And yet, backstage, he whispered to himself, they're clapping for the wrong person. They don't know the truth. The cheat had made him doubt even the undeniable. The praise, the achievements, the moments of triumph, they were never his own. At least, that's what he told himself. But slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift. He noticed the way younger colleagues looked to him for guidance, the way clients relied on his expertise, the subtle respect he commanded in meetings. And for the first time he paused. Maybe I am not a fraud. Even then, the imposter syndrome did not vanish. It was persistent, like a shadow stretching across every success, every smile, every quiet victory. Some nights, lying awake, he would replay conversations, editing and critiquing, imagining every possible way he had been exposed. The cheat, lying to himself, was always there, whispering, demanding vigilance, shaping his every thought. Yet the cheat also became a tool. He learned to observe it, to recognize the voice not as truth, but as a reflection of fear. When it whispered that he was unworthy, he could answer with evidence. The emails that praised him, the projects he had led successfully, the moments of real impact he had made. It was painstaking work, a negotiation with himself, but it was the first time he realized the cheat could be reversed. He could stop lying to himself and start speaking the truth, slowly, carefully, intentionally. One late night, as rain pattered against the office window, he allowed himself a quiet triumph. He had completed a proposal that would shape the company's next major initiative. Normally, he would have dismissed it as a fluke, a product of chance rather than skill. This time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his own capability. He read through the proposal, noted the careful reasoning, the innovative ideas, the clarity of vision, and whispered aloud, I did this. I earned this. The words felt strange, almost alien, but powerful. And yet, he knew the battle would continue. Imposter syndrome was not a one-time enemy to defeat. It was a companion, sometimes cruel, sometimes instructive. He would wake up tomorrow and feel the same doubts, face the same anxieties, confront the same subtle fear of exposure. But now, he carried a weapon the cheat could not anticipate: awareness. He knew the difference between reality and the lie he had told himself for years. And with that knowledge, he could act despite fear, succeed despite self-doubt, and live with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned the hardest truth. The only imposter he ever needed to outsmart was the one inside his own mind. Over time, this subtle, internal victory reshaped his life in ways he hadn't imagined. He took risks he would have avoided. He spoke up in meetings without the usual pretense of humility. He mentored colleagues with honesty and empathy, seeing his own worth reflected in the growth of others. Friends noticed a change, not flamboyant, but steady, self-assured, quietly resilient. Even his failures began to feel different. No longer shameful proofs of inadequacy, but lessons, opportunities to measure himself against reality rather than fear. At the end of it all, he realized that the cheat, the lie, the deception, the self-imposed limitations was never about the world outside. It was a story he had told himself to survive. And now, for the first time, he was writing a new story, one where he did not have to hide from his own potential. Where fear could exist without being the master. Where doubt could be acknowledged without being the jailer. The imposter syndrome cheat had taught him, in its own cruel way, that true courage was not in perfection, but in the willingness to keep showing up, to keep trying, to keep claiming the life he had always earned, even when the voice inside begged him to believe otherwise.